But basically, for the ones that don't know me, I'm the research lead in our BLOCKPASS Identity Lab. I want to correct something a little bit, which is that I am an academic, first and foremost. I run the research lab. I am on the BLOCKPASS Technical Advisory Board, but I don't think this presentation really goes that much into BLOCKPASS, to be honest. So I sit on various technical advisory boards, and I've advised the UK government's all-party parliamentary group on blockchain, on the effects of technology and indeed distributed ledgers on society. And actually that brings me neatly to one of the points that I always like to make, which is I don't like talking about blockchain. And it's not that I don't like the technology, it's that I don't like the associated baggage that words and technologies have, when really it's about solving a problem. It's not about applying a specific technology, it's about applying the right technology to whatever that problem is. And I think that's been responsible for a lot of the hype and problems that we've had in this industry thus far. But tonight I'm going to talk about identity. Now, what are the problems? Well, basically, the problem is trust. How do you know who you're talking to online, and how do you know that the claims that they make about themselves are accurate? Well, you don't. And also, it brings me neatly to one of my favourite, I guess, cartoons about the internet, which is on the internet, nobody knows that you're a dog, because there is no real verification that the person you're talking to is a human. In fact, for those of you who use Twitter, quite often they're not. And I'm also probably one of the only people to actually cite properly for these. Fair use, etc., etc. So basically, real-world identity. When we interact with the real world, I'm going to stand here, because clearly I've not memorized this properly. When we interact with the real world, we often have to prove who we are. So there's various use cases for that. So obviously, if I want to be able to drive, I've got to be able to present a driving license credential that attests that, it's all right, that attests that I am over a certain age and I am not banned from driving, or I don't have a condition that would ban me from driving. Equally, if I want to go to the bar, then, I mean, I've not been ID'd in a while, but that's just because I work for Bill. And it does age you. Sorry, I couldn't resist. Couldn't resist the jab, especially because I know he's going to watch this. So basically, you're not actually relying on them trusting you, though. You're relying on the third party. So in the case of driver's licenses, it's the DVLA. And you're basically relying on them to issue a credential that is, not hackable. And yeah, they check the picture, but it's more about the actual power the credential has through, for example, the pass scheme. Now that kind of happens online as well, because, for example, you're trusting that in that case, it's almost self-sovereign in a little way, in that you are making the credentials about yourself, and you're not really providing any backing for it in a lot of cases. Certainly, if you look at people's LinkedIns, you'll see all sorts of made-up nonsense. But what is an identifier, though? Because that's kind of the beginnings of what identity is. And basically, well, online, it's a username and password. Now, an identifier could also be your passport, because basically, your username and password in combination are I guess, passport to your digital services. But there are lots of problems with username and passwords, and obviously, as an academic in the cybersecurity field, I personally believe there's no reason to store a password in 2019, but people still do. Now, there's lots of problems with passwords, so as you can see there, people will make easy to remember passwords, because if you're signed up to 6,000 sites or 600 sites, which is not an unreasonable number if you actually consider the number of registrations you've made, you will make easier passwords, or you will share passwords across, because otherwise you're not going to remember them and have to go through the hassle of reset. Now, there are solutions there, and I think if anyone saw me at my talk for the launch of the research lab, where I railed against the big tech companies, you'll see that I don't trust them, but if there is social identity, you can rely on Facebook to provide your credentials, you can rely on Twitter to provide your credentials, but I don't. And you know what, show of hands, how many people in this room trust Facebook? I feel like there might actually be someone here, but they're too afraid of the crowd reaction to being the only person to put their hand up. So basically, an identifier has associated attributes, and those attributes include things such as your name, your address, even what you look like is an attribute of yourself. Sorry, I'll let you in. And so we can do these sort of low-trust transactions, though, where, for example, I pay to buy something, and you can do that for low-cost purchases, because quite often they use payment gateways, and so they're not actually storing your data. You're not trusting. I'm not actually trusting in most vendors to hold my card details. Instead, I'm trusting in WorldPay, which again is its own problem, or any of the other merchants like that. But that means that it's essentially just delegating that trust to someone else who you might not even be that aware of, which is itself a real problem. Now, for high trust transactions, like for example, the only reason that the passport service isn't entirely digital, well, okay, there's a lot of reasons that are mainly bureaucratic because this is the UK, but the passport service could be entirely digital if we had trusted credentials that I could provide and also be able to verify from a third party that these credentials are correct. Instead, what we do at the moment is we do the check and send process, and then we have to do an interview if you're unlucky enough for that, and then you finally get issued that credential. That's a 6-week process, I think it is, and it does not need to take that long. It's entirely down to the way that we've built systems and the way that we've built the internet and the way it has gone from its original vision and become so centralized. So the other problems are obvious, so unwanted correlation. So for example, you use the same address, you use enough of the same information on one site that you use on another one. So that means that you are tying all those accounts together, where if there was multiple breaches, they would then be able to see what you're up to. And that's a problem if you were signed up to Ashley Madison, for example, and you were using the same email that you used for Facebook. It's also a problem because people reuse passwords, so one breach then breaches the rest of them, which is its own real problem. The other thing, which I'm very much against, is centralized identifiers. Or rather, when I say that, I mean I'm against pooling all of our identity into one place for a purpose. And so I had hoped to talk about the recent change in legislation relating to the adult industry, because essentially the idea was that you would give your passport, your credit card, or some sort of proof of identity. They didn't really figure out which one. That's all right. And you would give it to MindGeek, the largest provider of adult content on the internet, and also, crucially, a company that's been bought several times and had their data passed across so many different servers. And the problem with that is that I think that's oppressive. I think the idea of a company holding on to your data, being able to not blackmail you, but being in play, basically making itself a honeypot for hackers who want to be able to blackmail someone. And the alternative to that, of course, for people who are not able to provide their details online, was that you went to a newsagent's and bought a physical license to view pornography, which is ridiculous. And they were £12, and that was going to revive the newsagents industry, I'm sure. But that's a terrible system. And you know what? It took until a week before the legislation was going to come into force, which was going to be April 1st, which I thought was hilarious because that's also April Fool's Day. It took until a week before that for them to go, actually, this isn't a good policy. Perhaps we're enabling oppression. Perhaps we are creating an area that will, it's an attack surface area that they're creating for no reason other than the whole, protect the children nonsense that's been used to justify so much bad legislation from time immemorial. So let's talk about the new internet. And I apologize, by the way, if you don't like my slide formats that's generated by Microsoft. So basically, decentralized identifier. So that means that the identifier is global. So it's basically a GUID. For those that don't know what GUIDs are, it's a globally unique identifier. And that essentially it's basically like a new URL. So you know the way that URLs work, where you type it in? Well, basically, there's a structure for that currently being standardized by the W3C, and that can take time, but that will essentially allow us to be able to provide a credential or provide the keys to unlock a piece of data about a person without having to have any sort of central server. And the other interesting part about that relating to the standard is that ownership can be cryptographically validated using proofs. And that means essentially that to a certain degree, this is the right person. So for example, we're a university, we accredit people with degrees, and so if they provide the identifier to say that they hold this data, we can verify and say, yes, we gave them a degree at this point. And that gets rid of a lot of problems, actually, in our industry around degree fraud. Because obviously we live in a global world where there is no standard for what a degree education is. And so there are differing standards, and even there are countries where you can just pay to get one, including this country for certain sons of dictators. That was Gaddafi's son who paid for his PhD, but there we go. Now, the other driver of this new internet, though, is verifiable credentials. So they're part of every life. So anybody here who has a wallet has a credential of some kind, because they either have a bank account, so they'll have their bank card on them, or they might have their ID. Those are credentials. But the important part about it isn't that, it's the verifiable part. So it allows you to cryptographically verify that basically that they haven't been changed, for example, that they were issued by a certain party, because it's about tamper resistance. And you'll probably notice I actually haven't said anything about blockchain so far. And I will touch on it briefly by saying that these standards are being driven by an organization, well, they're being driven by the Linux Foundation and by an organization known as Evernym, and also by the Sovereign Foundation. And they are essentially proposing that their system is the new trust-based system for the internet. As we all know, PKI is broken, as Bill likes to say all the time. Now, basically, the way that that works is that I'm an issuer. I say that you have a degree from me. I can store that, but once a verifier, so for example, your employer wants to see what your degree classification is, they check in what is known as a verifiable data registry. Now, that is where the blockchain comes into it, because that essentially, it maintains all your IDs and ensures that basically ensures that immutably that this credential was given by this person and this transaction was made. And it's not stored by any central party. It's stored, in the case of Sovereign, validated by stewards around the world, completely globally distributed, and also by the participants. So could be, for example, us. We would participate so that we could verify that someone who's going to do a PhD program at the university, that their degree is legit and that the standards upheld in that country match ours. That's the thing. And it is a real problem, because I've done quite a few. And actually, anybody here who's interviewed has probably done enough sifts to know that, first of all, what they put on their CV doesn't actually really mean anything, to be honest. I mean, I maintain my CV, but people lie on it all the time. If you were able to verify exactly how someone did at a micro level, so how they did in specific classes, and in a way that we can't really do now, because the transcript is, I mean, it's not difficult to fake a paper document. If you were able to do that, you would probably be able to speed up the employment process, for example, which is a real issue. So next, I'm going to talk about the technical stuff. Now, this is where you'll probably switch off, because I'm a maths guy, I'm a computer science guy, and now we're going to talk about zero-knowledge proofs. Now, zero-knowledge proofs are a cryptographic proof of a fact, well, cryptographically validated proof of a fact without actually processing the data in the first place. So, for example, I can present you with a credential that says I am over 18 and therefore legal to buy a drink, without actually having to give you my age. You don't have to store it. All you do is store that proof that's been validated by whatever the authority happens to be. It could be the passport office, it could be the DVLA, and they have said, as a government agency, as a trust anchor, that this person is over 18. But what's also important to me personally is data minimization. So if you look at your driver's license, you will see on it that there is an address field. Now, I don't think mine has ever been up to date, but there's an address field. There's a date of birth. Now, interestingly, only the month and year of that matter. There's your name. I mean, why do I need to give up my name to buy a drink? It's ridiculous. But that applies to so many other sectors where we are giving far more data than we have to, and certainly in the world of GDPR when it comes to digital trust. The fact that giving too much data and retaining too much data is a problem that doesn't really work with the legislation. So, trust, check, proved. So basically, these are my free buzzwords. Now, my free buzzwords are essentially the areas where digital identity could really make a difference. So trust. So we say a bank trusts the government ID credential because we know it does. If you want to go and set up a bank account, you need some form of government-issued identifier. And basically, that in this new world, the bank doesn't store any of this information on you. It's just able to validate it when it needs it using these distributed third-party verifying servers. Equally, you can check someone's credentials. So it's not just about being able to trust them, but it's actually also being able to do checks. So one of the use cases that I look at quite a lot is in the healthcare sector. So I'm not sure how much of a problem it is in Scotland, but in England and Wales, they make extensive use of locum doctors. And so the problem with that, though, is that the process takes 2 weeks, because obviously to be able to provide, You've come right at the end as well, sorry mate. But to be able to provide healthcare, you need to satisfy certain standards. You need to do disclosure and barring. You need to have a licensed medical degree from an accredited university. And of course, you need to do that. That applies to all fields, the UK right to work check. Well, what if you only had to do that once and could then present that credential to every new employer? That would save a lot of time and man hours, and to me, there's a lot of financial value in that. Equally, with checking of degrees, you're able, if you were able to do that at micro level, you could then be able to sift for example, I want a machine vision person, and I want who got the highest score in that class, because the problem is that at the moment these systems are held at university level, but actually if you were able to check and see how people did it very niche areas, you'd get much better employees out of it. Anyway, I wanted to do a lightning talk because I actually don't like talking for 40 minutes and then everyone switches off. Although I have realised that means the people that came at the end have missed it in its entirety.
So what makes you think that these fancy systems which are basically the same thing would be adopted in our lifetime?
Well, okay, so you make one good point, which is that there have been many proposals to improve digital trust, and even to improve real life trust, that have not been adopted. And usually these are the result of either barriers in, for example, government IT projects, or indeed lack of interest. Because one of the things that was on my slides is that there is research that says that the reason, what was I going to say? The reason why we do deletion the way that we do. So the way that we do deletion, for those that don't know on a technical side, is that we remove all links to it and we put in the metadata for that file the word delete, and then you shift that into unallocated space. And the reason it does that, which is much quicker than proper data erasure, is because there are a lot of scientific studies into the fact that people actually, they don't care about security in that way. What they care about is getting more available space so they can put more of their photos on it. So you do make a good point there. I think that the reason why this is driving, and certainly there are already places that have adopted it, British Columbia, West Australia for example, are very progressive on it. But I can't actually say an ultimate this will happen. I'm just saying that we've designed a good system and we're going to sit and talk about it for years as we always do. Who knows if that'll translate into anything. That's what I'm going to say, because I'm an academic, so I'm not going to say that, for example, Hyperledger India or the Sovereign Foundation are going to solve things, because that's not what I do. My role here is to encourage you all to question the prevailing winds and see if you guys can go on to do something greater. That's the role of the academic in life, and that's kind of what I'm trying to do, less so than saying we've fixed the internet, which would not. Yeah.
Alright, so can you walk me through the process? I'm a traveling doctor, I get hired by various hospitals.
Yes.
And now the first hospital checks all my credentials.
Yes.
Now what happens?
Well, so I will actually say that doctors have a very specific process. So the way that they do it in England and Wales is the post office have verification booths. And they insist on doing it this way at the moment, but there should be a better system. But the verification booths, you actually physically go into, provide your fingerprint, and they do a scan of your face as well, and check your physical documents. Then they sign off and say this person is has a right to work in the UK. So you then the post office generate the credential, and then when the hospital wants to employ you, the hospital then checks the registry and sees the post office has signed up on this. We agree with the post office, we trust it, and therefore this person has the right to work. So the user only generates it once. The hospital in this case checks it for every one of their doctors. If you get what I mean?
Alright. No, I'm not familiar how that works, but okay. So
I was going to say hospitals are it's unfortunately, because of the regulatory environment, a very specific process.
Well, let's do it for a bank account. So I go to a bank to open an account. They look at me and look at my ID card and they see, looks very similar. I believe that is the person on the card.
No. So basically, so you have credentials which could be stored on a phone, for example. So those credentials, they just look like a URL. You provide that to the bank, and because the bank trusts the third-party service, which is the globally distributed part, they then know that the credential you applied is valid, and they know that the process for creating that credentials is also valid, using that cryptographic technique I mentioned, which I know is a bit technical. But it's digital
they still need to
signing
know that it
basically.
belongs to me, right? That I'm not impersonating someone else.
Yes,
So
yes.
how do they know that?
Basically,
They
digital.
hashed a picture of my face or something.
No. It's digital signing. So it's basically when you create that credentials, it's signed in your name that this is
Okay,
your
so my
credential.
phone signs it.
Exactly, and then when you want to pass that to someone else, now that doesn't really apply in most identity use cases. You are then able to delegate access to that by providing your URL.
Yeah, but that would mean I can open a bank account in whoever's name I get their private key off, right?
Well, so that's one of the problems is wallets at the moment, to be honest with you. So I've been looking at various methods for improving security and usability of wallets, but you're absolutely right in that,
That's why I have the picture and ID card to verify it's active.
Yeah. So there are extra steps there, yeah.
You mentioned passports and there being no reason why they shouldn't be more digital than they are at the moment.
Well, yeah, I would say that that's broad brush because I'm aware of rural areas that have no internet, for example. If that's the sorry, I'll let you finish it.
In a sense, you were talking about them. They could be more dematerialised than they are at the moment, but you seem to concentrate on the registration process, and you didn't say a great deal about the sort of ongoing operation of them, because if a passport doesn't have a physical existence at creation point, then it has implications as to how it's operated, independent of the registration process. And I think you mainly talked about what you viewed as defects in the registration process.
Well, what aspect of the registration process is it that concerns you? Oh, sorry, not the registration, sorry, the ongoing process, the operational process.
I'm not concerned.
Okay.
I just wondered if you had any views on that.
Well, so
yourself.
obviously, so this is one of the reasons why there will be struggles to adoption, is that you are essentially trusting this technology to store your passport, and for, as we have at the moment, 10 years, because if you had to re-register every year, or if you had to re-verify that credential every year, that's worse than a passport to a lot of people, and they wouldn't do it. So you are relying on the long-term, I guess, lasting power of the technology, because it doesn't exist anywhere but on this distributed storage. So it exists throughout the globe, maintained by the stewards that run the system. But you're right, if the technology somehow went under in some way, then that's also a problem. But it's why you wouldn't store sensitive information in that way. What you would do is you would store an identifier, a GUID that leads to that information. Because I wouldn't tell anyone to store sensitive information in that way.
There is a problem that wouldn't be a problem to the user of the passport, but to the people who are interested in the users of the passport, in that analogously to your thing about buying a drink and age verification, and does someone need to know your identity to do that? No, they only need to know that it's legitimate to sell you a drink. Similarly, using similar technologies, it would be possible to verify that someone can legitimately cross a border without identifying them in the process. And I suspect that might not be welcomed by the authorities that were doing
I would. You know what? It depends. So I don't know if you're familiar with the operations of the new airport in Dubai, but the idea is that their borders are all done in that way. So they've got cameras that check against European crime databases, etc. Now the problem with that system is they actually are storing facial biometrics, which obviously is wildly dystopian. But yeah, you are right, there will be pushback from the existing systems because it will allow you to do things that previously were not possible and that they don't want you to do. In the same way that when you do any major IT change, you are essentially pissing on someone's turf and they won't be happy about that. So it's, there is give and take, so there has to be benefit both for the user and for the government or whatever organisation you're verifying with, because otherwise they just won't play ball.
I mean, effectively what you're describing is what you were talking about with centralised identifiers. So when you talk about centralised identifiers, people tend to think of a passport number or a driving licence number. But actually, when it boils down to it, your first name, last name, date of birth is pretty much a centralised identifier, because the chances of somebody with the same name and date of birth existing is relatively small in any given sample of people. So that's what a standard passport check might well be checking for, is this person on a no-fly list or whatever it happens to be. Yeah,
and obviously the other industries where there is concern is obviously finance, because there's the idea of strict liability, that you are responsible if you deal with someone who is on the sanctions or politically exposed persons list. So if you can't say with complete certainty that you can prove that, then they're not going to play ball. And indeed, I've worked with quite a few banks who have concerns, especially in the world of zero knowledge proofs and the idea of not having any access to any data, because they want to be able to do their sanctions checks and know the gravity of what could happen if their sanctions checks do not happen in accordance with the procedure they've spent the last 50, 60 years building. Yeah.
Can I just go back to slide with the systems?
Yeah.
And could you just, I wondered if you could expand a bit more on,
Yes.
you said, you know, the blockchain that comes in, the verifiable data register.
Yeah.
I wondered if you could just expand a bit more on, I guess, cases when you felt like the blockchain would be particularly useful there, and cases where it might not be necessary for this type of system.
So I think it's particularly useful. I think it's particularly useful in cases where, for example, your transactions are borderless. Because one of the problems with centralized identity systems is that they don't take into account the fact that, for example, GovUK verified doesn't work. You can't use that to prove something in another country, obviously. But if you're taking part in global transactions, which may, for example, relate to payments between developing markets, or it may involve some degree of trust. So actually, to be honest with you, the line I would draw is if you don't trust the people you're dealing with, you use blockchain. If you trust the people you're dealing with, there's no reason to use a blockchain. So on one side we have the internal banking system at the moment. So the way that CHAPS works at a very high level, because I'm obviously not from the financial industry, but basically the idea is that all the organisations send payments between each other, and there are physical people that check that, and there is a level of trust and transparency. While it is private, but within the industry there is that transparent nature already there. On the other hand, I don't particularly trust the government that much to deal with a lot of identity situations, not because I'm a mad libertarian or anything, but like, I feel like my data transactions should be mine. So I would say that's where blockchain is important. Or, for example, if you're dealing in any industry where you don't trust each other, that's what I would do.
So to take the hospital example again, you might say a set of NHS hospitals would say we can trust each other.
Yes.
As if they were, say, looking at a network that included French hospitals or something.
Well, not even French hospitals necessarily, but if the network included, so actually you've led on to what I think is one of my favourite examples. If you look at it from a healthcare perspective and bring in device manufacturers, so if you bring in people like HP and Siemens, they don't trust each other because they're competitors. And not only are they competitors, but for example, if in a supply chain use case for blockchain, if they see that there's been a whole load of recalls on HP devices, or that they've left the hospital for some reason, Siemens are just going to ring up and say, well, you know, we've got devices with a lower failure rate, here you go, because they've got access to that data. So yeah, it's mainly private organisations, because I actually don't see a reason why French hospitals wouldn't necessarily trust UK hospitals. Mm-hmm. Private sectors, when you get, well, okay, that's not strictly true, but there's not a lot of trust between competitors, and there's no reason for a lot of the public sector to compete in that kind of way. My opinion, that last part. Because I know it's actually not how it works, but...
So Liam, what's interesting about this is what you said earlier, where it's you can verify something without getting an exact answer, like you can verify somebody's over 18 without having to discover their age, right? Is that one of the key points there?
Yes, so I think it is important because in certain industries where you actually own your own data and the party you're dealing with has no real reason to store your data, then zero knowledge proofs are fantastic. So that's what's described as a range proof. Now, I want to say that while blockchain is considered by many to be a relatively immature platform, zero knowledge proofs have existed for around, well, I would say at least 50 years, possibly longer, because they've been used for other applications. And certainly it's just an expansion of logic gates. But yeah, I would say that's particularly important.
Following on from that, do all zero knowledge proofs require, to my understanding, is you have to register a cryptographic representation of the answer somewhere for someone to verify it without knowing your actual birth date? So
a zero knowledge proof is essentially just, the way to see it is a proof that a transaction happened in a pre-agreed way, and that's why they're not really used as generics. But basically, there is no correlation between your age and the proof that's generated. Instead, the range proof says, basically the range proof goes between, say, 18 and 200, and it says, does this number exist in this range, and that's the only question it asks. So it's set up to specifically to capture an age that is between 18 and 200.
But do you have to register anything with this verifiable registry? Is there a common piece of information that both the verifier and the claimer have to have access to, which requires some form of...
Yeah, so they will have their own identifiers. So for example, this university will have an identifier, and it will have a reputation attached to that. And so that identifier will then be used when somebody wants to do a right to work check or to prove that someone has a qualification, that it was issued from this party. So it's actually more about the relationship between the parties rather than the data itself. It is quite warm in here. Right, I suppose if that's us.
When you said you don't like talking about blockchain or cryptocurrency, is that because it's seen as a buzzword or the media portrayed it in one sort of way? Do you sometimes feel like if you're talking to friends and family outside of the space, do you sometimes feel like you're bashing your head off a brick wall, or as soon as you say something they'll just react in a certain way? So, kind of, yeah. I mean, one of the problems is that the industry has received the reputation that it has. And as a result, if I'm trying to sell blockchain, for example, in one of my other roles as a technical advisor, you just can't, because they've seen this reputation of Bitcoin, of money laundering, of drugs and prostitution, and gone, that's probably not the technology for me. But that's just because you don't understand it yet. So yeah, that's why I try to avoid using the B word in that way. I can relate to that.
Yeah.
The exact same feeling. How do you feel? How do you think it's possible to navigate around that, or accelerate adoption and debunk popular misconceptions? Because I think the way I always relate it is compare it to the internet and the way people felt about the internet in the mid-90s, early 90s, this kind of thing. But how do we move it forward and get away from that?
Well, I think we need to, in part, we need to stop having a technology-focused mindset towards problems and start actually having the problem-focused mindset, which is that, for example, if I'm selling a solution that solves a problem, I don't say, oh, it's got an Oracle database and it's got all of this, unless their client requirements specifically need it. But if their problem is, for example, building site safety checks, I will say we will do it this way, but I usually won't mention the word blockchain because I just don't think it's useful. And I think that the fanaticism about the term that's been generated is also not useful either, because I know people did do it back in the day, but the business person on the other side of the room doesn't care. They care that you're solving their problem and that you're delivering them with a certain advantage in some way against their competitors. I don't think they care about the specifics in terms of technology, unless you're integrating with legacy applications, of course. But yeah, that's my opinion.
In terms of, I mean, this is almost going back to the first question. In some ways, obviously, if you've got a verifiable data registry, if we count that as being as the centre, how do you think we will get to the point where anybody will be trusted as a verifiable data registry? I'm not saying that anybody should be, but obviously, for instance, pass cards, young Scott citizen cards, or whatever, they will only accept certain processes before they will issue with a card. So one of their rules is you must have an audit trail. So you could be the best verifier in the world, but if you insist that you can't keep hold of personal data or even record the fact that you've seen personal data, you can't be a pass. You can't issue a pass card because you don't meet their rules. So how do you see this evolving with registry providers, if you like, going forward? Obviously, GovVerify has said, we're going to accredit various people to provide this kind of assertion.
So I think in the short term we're going to have to work with the existing identity providers who have, for example, the government has its reputation for providing a service, and it has that because it's been around, in our case, for hundreds of years. Longer term, I think it will move towards a reputational based model where there will be more verifiers who come out there and are able to verify because they have developed a reputation over a long period of time, could be 20 years, of proving identities, and the identities that they're proving are sound and are just as valid as those issued elsewhere. But it's a long-term vision, that.
So it's a sort of the Experian type model that we currently have.
Because I think we do have to use that in the short term as trust anchors, because I as an individual can't go out in the street and say he's over 18 and then somebody's going to let him buy drinks. It's got to be, we're going to work with the systems we exist in. And my general view as well, and it's quite personal views here, but my general view as well is that English. I keep forgetting. My general view is that look, that's gone. Sorry, guys. Yeah, sorry, so no more questions.
So these identity providers, do you see them being commercial entities rather than maybe some sort of open source organisation?
I think there'll be a combination, in the same way that, I think there'll be a combination. So obviously some people trust in their government to allow them to do certain things, and that trust is unlikely to change. But so other people would prefer it to be commercial. They would prefer to trust the private sector to deliver what they want. Because I think that at the end of the day, the selection of identity providers, without going super capitalist, is down to the market and what the market wants. And if the market wants commercial identity providers, that'll happen. But we're not quite there yet. And certainly with UK Verify, it's all commercial providers, because the government doesn't want to do that itself. As far as I'm aware, that you might know. Are there any government ones on it?
No. I mean, I think the original sort of blueprint was, I think, for Verify, if I remember rightly, and other people might know better. The original blueprint was government isn't trusted, therefore, to look after my identity. Why would I want the government to look after my identity? Because they will link things together. So go to a commercial provider who has no interest in my data whatsoever, allegedly, and let them
Experian has no interest,
and let them assert my identity on my behalf to government. The fact that you're using potentially, you have to then rely on, when you've got a verifier, which is a government department, and another verifier that's a government department, you've got to rely on the fact that they're not actually going to be given a common.
I will say as well, as a rule, you kind of touched on it there, that when I'm proving something to the government, I don't want them to be the verifier. I would want private sector to be the verifier. But perhaps when I'm proving something to a private sector, I might want the government to be the ones that attest my identity, because you don't want that conflict of interest there. And I can kind of see where the government's coming from in terms of not wanting to be its own identity provider, because essentially it's just proving something for itself, which is inherently selfish. But yeah.
Sorry, I missed you talking. The traffic out there is a nightmare. So I might have missed something. But I mean, you talked about reputation and institutions that run for a long time, and you seem to pick the example of the age and 18 or whatever in terms of buying a drink. But I mean, surely things like National Records for Scotland, which hold date of birth, deaths, marriages, and so forth, have that information. So on a sort of batch basis, if they were the issuer over on your left-hand side, they could provide, it might be, you're over 18, you're dead or you're not dead, but certain things that don't expose your date of birth.
Yeah.
But they put into the verifiable data registry an attestation, I think, that this person's over 18. So how would that sort of sit in your world?
Well, so I can see that. To be honest with you, I can see National Records Scotland being part of that. Because to me, they're just another identity provider. In my opinion, and this is my opinion with all technology policy, is that there should be many providers. I just see National Records Scotland as another existing provider that will sit on that platform, and it certainly could be good for them as well, because there will be benefits to be gleaned from being part of this. But because what we have at the moment as well is a tech monopoly, because certain aspects of government, I have to say it this way, certain aspects of government don't understand technology very well, and so legislate in ways that, for example, can't necessarily be trusted. So instead, we shouldn't allow the current world, because the current world we live in is where Facebook has a monopoly on your social identity, basically. And so they are the identity provider. If you want to use them externally, you can. I would never do that, but it's up to you if you want to. In an ideal world, there'd be hundreds of these companies that can do this. As many as the market can support is my view on it. And National Records Scotland would be one of those, in my opinion, that would be particularly good, because I think it is a trusted institution, more so than even other agencies in that area.
It's an interesting point you make, because NRS do hold obviously records about everybody, sometimes not in their own right, because if you, like me, were born in Scotland, there will still be a record for you within the Scottish NHS, and actually NRS are responsible for managing that list as well. The problem comes that historically, the sort of fears that Liam's articulated about government using your data incorrectly have meant that it's very much shuttered off, and it's only allowed to be used for certain purposes. Now the issue is if you've got a technology base, as Liam just alluded to, whereby you can leverage that without necessarily exposing the personal data that lies behind it, then maybe you need to look at the legislation again to say, well, maybe we should allow that data value to be exploited by individuals, because I mean, what's the point of NRS knowing that you were born and are old enough to buy something if they won't let you actually prove it using their information? They'll let you do it with a birth certificate that they've issued based on the data that they hold, but they won't actually do it on the electronic side. So there's this element where, like Liam said, we're playing catch up with that, because effectively the data exists because the document only reflects the data at the end of the day. So how do we leverage that in a way that people feel comfortable with? Because, for instance, I mean, the example that hits me is obviously those of you that have hired a car in the last 2 or 3 years, you don't have to produce your driving license per se. You produce an electronic permission to see the driving license. But strangely enough, you need to know your national insurance number. Well, when has your national insurance number been part of your driving record? What's going on in the background there? Well, I guess somewhere along the line, some of the stuff that went on between the passport office and BVLA and ID cards back in the mid-2000s resulted in some linkages there that they can now exploit. Now they're only exploiting it to just do a double check on who you are before they allow you to give somebody else access to your data. So the probable outcome is what people would want, but it's possibly less transparent than you might hope for.
Yeah, is the Scottish Government still going to need to issue digital citizenship cards?
I don't know, I don't work for the Scottish Government.
It obviously gets to a point at the moment in Estonia, for example, not here tonight, but they have the world's most advanced digital society. Surely with self-sovereign digital identity, it gets to a point where the government only have to actually verify the individual.
Well, I think that could happen, but it's about transition, and that's one of the points to make. Is people that tell you that tomorrow we're going to, like anybody that would tell you that tomorrow we're going to throw away all of our old physical identifiers and we all have to use an app. It's madness. It's a transition from the current world we live in, where we will rely for a short term on trust in organisations that have existed for a long time for specific use cases, into a world where everyone else can, because you build up a reputation over time. But yeah, I can make no comment on the Scottish Government. That's not my that's not my gift.
Is there a risk that you start trusting? You know, we've got lots of app references here, and I pass across my electronic token. Well, there's an argument that says that this is one of the least trusted devices around because it's so easy to track, and that there is, in some schools, a thought a movement back to less intelligent devices just because they don't want to be tracked, and I use that word not in a technical sense. And then you get back to, well, this is why you have paper passports, because, and why you used to have checks, because it's the only form of, it's the lowest common denominator.
So it's the same reason why, for example, if you have a driving license from before a certain date, you can use your paper one that has absolutely no face on it at all. And that's because you have to have a transition for people, and so I hate to be a tech pessimist, but it could well be decades before we see this type of system built. And it will also require a fundamental change in our attitudes towards mobile devices, for example, because you do make a good point that a lot of people would say that they are possibly the least trusted thing we carry about with us. But it requires a state change.
I have a question. So, does I correctly understand that BLOCKPASS is a direct competitor to the Google Identity Service, where you can log in with your Google email or with your Google account to a lot of services?
Yes, they could be, yes.
Okay.
But the idea behind the BLOCKPASS model is KYC once. So you prove who you are and that you're not on, for example, a sanctions list. You do that once, and then you can pass that on to anybody. So yes, you could use it for the traditional single sign-on, but it's also used by some companies in the financial sector, who I can't mention, for doing KYC checks.
Okay.
How long would that be valid for? Because presumably you could not be on a list and then go on a list.
So it depends on the certificate. Obviously I didn't build the app, so I can tell you exactly the time it goes for. But I think it also depends on the specific customer. So for example, a bank might require new checks over a much shorter amount of time, but it's still digital KYC as opposed to the current paper process. So it's still quicker from that point of view, because the paper process at the moment can take 2-3 weeks for buying a property, for example, and then that's just doing the KYC and proof of income checks.
I think that's a very valid point. KYC and all the anti-verification process since I've become a money launderer, I still pass the bank check. Now that probably satisfies the bank criteria because they've done the best they could, but it doesn't, it's not the purpose of the legislation.
Exactly, yeah.
So all these, your little diagram, your once-off issuer, verifier, for a lot of these things, other than things that occur at fixed points in time, you've been to school, you've been to a second school, you've been to a third school, you've been to a fifth school, at various stages during your life, they're fixed events, you pass a driving test. Whoops, you got banned, you have to repass a test. So you have to go through another process.
Yeah.
But some of these things, like banks and such like, are more ethereal. Yeah, they have to occur all the time. So this is a continuous improvement then.
Yeah, I will agree. I think it depends entirely on the sector. It's all about risk profile. So you're right to highlight some areas will want constant checks because they haven't covered their own arse. And some sectors are happy to receive a proof because it happened, as you said, in a fixed period of time. So it entirely depends on the sector, to be honest. But the other part being that the regulations around this area are in flux, and certainly I think it's not now, but I think it might be next week. The G20 are meeting to discuss legislation, not common legislation, but similar legislation that will cover the purchasing and use of digital currency, for example. And certainly in the UK Parliament there's been a digital currency bill sitting behind a raft of Brexit legislation for quite a while. But there is the Brexit of it, so.
But the thing is, I mean, what you're saying about the need to potentially continually verify, that's possible in the electronic arena where it isn't
exactly,
in the paper arena.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the example that sprang to mind while you described that is actually, I worked for a company at one point and they said, right, we're going to have you on an electronic driver check, and we basically will take all your license details and send them off to be checked that you're valid to drive any of our company vehicles. But then nobody actually thought about it until about 2 or 3 years later that actually they needed to do that virtually continually because somebody could get banned in the interim, and if they didn't actually admit to it. So I mean, you could see, I say a utopia, maybe it's not a utopia, where you could sit in a car and the car says, actually, are you still licensed to drive? You've been banned again.
I do love it. Actually, it was one of the early Ethereum use cases was automation relating to cars. So, for example, you could pay someone to get out of your way on the road. It's one of the early use cases, but also automatic switching off of cars if you don't have a legal right to drive. But that is a utopian world. Yeah, I know. I'm not suggesting that.
If you're the person who's managed to get banned several times, then I would imagine that
probably not.
The person standing in front of the car is probably sitting and going utopian. Yeah.
Who pays for the checks?
So in that,
I'm buying my drink and do I pay a little extra every time
So the problem is it depends entirely on the implementation.
Yeah.
In the financial sector, digital KYC, as we've done it, can be very, very cheap, and so the merchant pays, the user doesn't pay. Verification in person, that's a battle that's currently being considered by some companies. And certainly I know that Yoti, some bars in England you can present your Yoti identifier. But I think because, again, it's a fixed, with buying a drink, it's a fixed, it's a fixed moment in time. You turned 18 at a certain time, you don't need to recheck that. So the initial check would be very, very inexpensive. So I imagine that you would be unlikely to see an increase in price of drinks, for example, as a result. And actually, but that's why it's so challenging to get it into that sector, though, is the question of, there's two drivers: financial benefit, which I don't think there is in this case, but also regulatory benefit. And the question is, are bars really being pressured to be better at checking people's ages for drinks? Depends on your locality entirely. It's such a hyper-local problem that I'm not sure that until it applies to other use cases, or unless the government provides it as a digital identity and therefore it's paid for by the government at some point, then in the same way that obviously they subsidise passports, because it costs more than £75 to make a passport. In the same way that currently happens, that'll happen, but it'll take time for that to be a thing. Because there is no financial driver for it, nor is there really that much, from what I've heard, really that much regulatory driver. Yeah.
I guess a follow-on from that is, if this is super cheap to do checks, if more and more things can be checked, it's easier to introduce gateways to quite minor things, just in everyday life, I guess.
Well, I mean, I guess that is kind of true, but if we look at it from a digital point of view, that could be automatic, so it doesn't actually add any overhead to an individual's workload. But it means that actually for the banks, for example, they can check even more details, and so they can get a more concise picture of whether or not they should lend to somebody, and therefore project into the future and say, using risk matrices, is this person likely to default, let's not lend to them, because they then have a greater amount of data that they can check in a shorter amount of time at no additional hassle to the user, is the idea, of course.
And I guess in that you could have templates of checking given to banks, say. So you could enforce your legislation more broadly rather than have it be individual to banks. Not that they'd be that keen to sign up.
Well, exactly. That's certainly my problem.
Because you've got conflicting legislation here, because it's part of the problem. Because doesn't the GDPR legislation say that you have a right to have any automated decision checked by a human?
I believe you're correct, yes.
So the more information a bank is checking, the more difficult it becomes for a human to check. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm using these words loosely, which actually makes an argument for, in that financial institution, we toss a coin to decide whether we lend you money or not, because it's easy for a human to verify that it came down heads.
I think there's a cost benefit analysis to be made, because you are right in that if a person made a GDPR request, and I will say I'm not a lawyer either, but if a person made a GDPR request, obviously that generates an overhead in time to do a manual check. So you'd have to work out on average how many GDPR checks are people actually doing, what is the likely overhead going to be, and calculate that instead as your savings rather than blind tuning. That's a business decision.
I guess that's the trick, isn't it, here? That if we have something like a right to an explanation for a decision, that whole mechanism is obscured potentially from me as well as the person announcing the decision. So that's pretty difficult legally, I suppose.
As I said, it requires a kind of shift in time, and a change will have to happen because otherwise, the law doesn't necessarily support every application of decentralized identity. While it supports some, and there are obviously already decentralized identity providers out there, it doesn't support all of them. Like finance is a particularly hard one.
Sorry, I don't know if you mentioned this earlier, but from a technical standpoint, if you have the blockchain, it's all based on the blockchain, or you store all the data on it?
No.
Oh, okay.
So you might store a GUID on the blockchain that relates to a piece of data, or it may relate to an organisation, and you validate that to figure out whether or not you trust the data being provided. So you get a GUID basically, which is anonymous.
So if somebody, for example, switch their name or switch their address or whatever you're storing,
they would have to get re-verified if they want to submit that ID again, because basically it'll do a check and see that's not the name they provided, and so we'll reject it. So they will have to do a check again if they change their name. But that also already applies anyway. When you change your name, you've got to change all your account names. The difference is you could actually only have to do it once and then provide it to all of them, rather than having to do it for each individual centralized service. No? Yeah, that's us.